It don't matter however you choose to do it.
All right, I think we got it here. What's up? What's up, T? You doing good?
Man, I'm as good as can be, man. All is good. How you doing out there in Florida?
Doing good in Florida, man. We are on two different sides of the country. I was gonna
Yeah.
say you represent the West Coast.
Two different sides of the country, but same side of righteousness. How about that?
Come on, come on.
Yeah.
Now I can
Yeah.
always count on you for them one-liners.
Oh my
Hey,
goodness.
man,
Oh,
we have. Let's get right into it. We have a lot going on right now. In this generation T, it's just very interesting that you oftentimes think about what people were really dealing with back in the civil rights movement. You think about what people were dealing with back during Vietnam and just all these other great historical things, never thinking in 1,000 years that you'd be caught right in the middle of something as catastrophic, if not in some ways worse. Um, my first pitch goes to you in the sense of where do you think we are? Do you think we are in a very turbulent, hopeless scenario, or do you think we're just kind of being dramatic and acting like we're the first to deal with, emergencies?
right. I don't think that necessarily we're in either. I think we're in a moment of opportunity when you have these kinds of things bring light to existing circumstances. It always gives us an opportunity to have the dialogue and to try to correct the mistake. And I think if we're being discerning, we would take notice that perhaps this is a conversation that God wants us to have because it keeps showing up over and over and over again. When will America deal with its race issue? When will America deal with its misogyny issues and issues along that line that make us feel like we're better than one another? So that's from my perspective, man. I think this generation is unfortunately fighting the battle of previous generations in this world. It's just what it looks like in 2020. So that's my 2 cents on where do you feel that where are we at and what statement do you think is being made?
I have to agree with you. I think you have a combination of the fact that we are in some ways caught off guard a little bit just simply because we were not aware of what we have already come from. You are your dad's son. I'm my father's son, and I'm his father's grandson and great grandfather and so forth. So I think sometimes we forget that we didn't just pop out of Instagram or pop out of Twitter, but that we come from legacies, we come from histories, we come from patterns. Some of those patterns have worked in our favor, and let's face it, some of those patterns have worked against us and to our disfavor. And I think that in some ways, in some fashion, what we are currently dealing with now has forced us to realize that we are not just, 10,000 likes on the Instagram picture. We're not just, 50 retweets from a cool statement or a cool song that we came up with, but we are part of a legacy and a history that's, let's face it, been untapped, unfixed, unchanged. And in many ways, we are reaping the harvest from that. My thing that I want to say is let's talk about the pandemic, the COVID-19.
That's a good place to start.
Yeah, let's start there real quick. I pray City is doing well.
We are the city. We are actually in a great. We have a great mayor, a good community of doctors that have really jumped on top of it in our city. So quite frankly, as far as all the larger cities in America, San Diego is doing pretty good. Yeah. That is not to say that we're not without flaws, but we are doing good. And it's also not to say that we don't feel the strain of the pandemic from other counties and other cities and even other states, man. But we're our brother's keeper. And that's one of the cool things about my city is we try to preach that we are our brother's keepers. So for the most part, of course there has been moments and instances that are happening. This pandemic has given us a unique chance to take a look at our healthcare system in California. It's given us a chance, particularly as people of color, to take a look at our general health and general well-being. How have we been taking care of ourselves? Are we set up physically for long-term health, or do we have so many pre-existing conditions that our future looks, bleak? So we've had some opportunities to do that. And in some cases, if you're not battling the pandemic, you're battling the stay home orders. That's been
quarantine.
hey, I've never been a better pastor than when all these husbands and wives have had to stay home together.
It's amazing how that the what do you call it, the rippling effect of COVID-19, how it changed not only our home dynamic, but also the way we approach ministry, right? Talk about that a little bit.
Well,
that's very different that's different for all of us. I don't care how long you've been in church. I don't care.
You can never get comfortable preaching to a camera, so I tell you what, a couple of things about that. A few things I've been trying to watch with the introspective eye. One, first and foremost, it is, again, a challenge to every person and every believer to recognize and realize that, man, God was never about the buildings, and the movement of God was never about the energy that we could create in a building or how good a preacher could preach to give you goosebumps. That was never the relationship with God. And I think if we're not careful, we will have missed that perhaps we've been celebrating the gathering more than we've been celebrating God. So that's number one.
Don't start nothing.
I came on here to start stuff. So let's get going. The second thing is I also see the hand of God in this, because there is such a resistance against having to be forced to be apart, that it leads me to believe that our natural inclination is that we should be together.
Yeah.
And the challenge is, on the other side of COVID-19, will we be able to come back together and integrate as people, as societies, as churches? Will we be able to figure out how to be together? It's clear we can't. We hate being apart. Yeah. We're frustrated. We're marching. We don't want to be separated. We're recognizing that we're interdependent human beings. So we want to come together. The question is, have we done the soul searching in our time of separation to ask ourselves, how do I live with my brother now? Wow. I want to be in connection with her. So how do I live with my sister now? Wow. How do I live with people that are different races and ethnicities and constructs and different ideas? How do we live? It's clear we're struggling being apart, but we can't struggle being apart and struggle being together.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's so interesting that when you see people now, like I was craving some Chick-fil-A. I'm not going to argue about Popeyes and Chick-fil-A as far as that's concerned, but Chick-fil-A.
I'm on your side with that one.
Chick-fil-A was there. I was passing by. I wanted some Chick-fil-A, and I pulled into the driveway. And now you have to go through the drive-through now, and it's a huge line, and they have all the kids outside serving and whatnot. And one of my youth was working at this Chick-fil-A, and I didn't know that, and she just all but started crying, Pastor Javen. And it was just like a thing where I think what it was the fact that she hadn't seen me physically in so long, and I felt the same way in seeing her. It was just interesting to be able to that feeling that you get when you haven't seen your church family closely like that. And I think it has done something in us, even if we don't know it subconsciously.
Yeah, we are people, and we're meant to do life together in some form or fashion. We're empathetic. We should and want to be vulnerable. We want to be in connection, want to be in contact. And it's particularly challenging when you're a pastor, because most pastors like people. You notice I said most. Most pastors like people. So it has not been easy on us in our profession, because this is kind of our calling to be connected and to get in the mix and get in the middle. So it's been an interesting challenge for all of us, but I have been spinning my wheels asking God, Lord, when we come back together, how can we preach messages, create community and opportunities for us to do life better together?
Yeah.
Because that's how you called us.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that everybody understands too, that there is patience, and the Bible says patience is a virtue, and that there, in the word virtue means lethal. And so that there, and they that wait upon the Lord, and you can go on down the line, that there is a way to come back together.
Yes.
And that we are being responsible enough to, if science is saying that this thing is still contagious and the numbers are still there, over 100,000 people dead in just America alone. I believe it's about 2.5 million that have dealt with some type of illness as it pertains to COVID-19 just in America alone, that we are patient enough and respectful enough that if we are needing to wear masks, when we go out and abroad, and if we need to kind of wait before coming back together as a church, that doesn't mean we don't have faith and that we're not walking in a godly fashion, understanding the pandemic of what we're dealing with. Let's shift gears here. Right now, we know that we are dealing with heightened racial tension across the nation. The recent scenario of George Floyd, I believe his name is, that was at the hands under the officers. He passed away. And as we speak now, there are riots, there are protests all across the country. I'm going to give you the first words. Talk to me.
Well, I think whenever we approach these kinds of scenarios, it's fair to use the language that is the most official language. And right now, George Floyd was murdered, and there is a suit against him. He has been charged with murder, and even with the minimal circumstances that we understand, what we are certain about is that for almost 9 minutes, a man who was in handcuffs had a knee on his neck, causing him to move into some kind of medical catastrophe that killed him. That's murder. The other part of the powder keg is that it came from the hands of a law enforcement officer, which historically, in minority contexts and communities, the badge does not always represent to protect and serve. Now, this is not a bashing moment about law enforcement. I have law enforcement officers in my family, tremendous amount of respect for it, but I've also lived in minority community contexts my whole life. And I do understand what heavy policing is like, what strong-handed policing can oftentimes feel like, and more than that, what power in the hands of an insecure person can be like. So those two together, being in minority context, as well as the powder keg of the law enforcement officer, as well as the untimely death of our brother, it has sparked again the memories of many people that unjustly have been at the helm of bad policing. But it's not just that, like if you think that that's all that's happening, and you're missing a picture that's so much larger than even my brother George. It's a picture of hopelessness. It's a picture of feeling powerless. It's also included in the conversation this sense that I'll never become the fullness of my potential in the environment that we currently have. And we have a legacy of this happening in our nation and in our country, man. So I think what you're seeing is the frustration, you're seeing the disappointment, you're seeing the anger. And while I'm not for any of the looting, let's stay that right there, not for any of the looting, there is something to be understood, that there is going to be some kind of release that comes out of a frustrated people.
Yeah, I was going to say, you definitely, I definitely feel like right now what you're seeing is a outward expression of an inward frustration. I don't think it's so much anger as much. I'm sure anger is there, but I think more than anger, I think people, there's a strain of frustration of what you've already mentioned, and that is the word hopelessness. and the possibility that things can and will get better, the possibility that I thought we were over this. I thought we were doing better. I thought this problem was not still in existence. I didn't know. And I think that's what these camera footage things remind us, is that this stuff is not over. This thing is still going on. And while you're on, minding your own business, somebody else in Georgia is being gunned down for jogging down the street, and nobody's being held accountable for it 60, 80 days in, only until somebody leaks a video. And then you kind of go, well, doggone, that could have been, my cousin. That could have been, we're both of us are black men. Both of us, I have a big son. You got a little baby son. You start thinking that could be my kids. And I think that, I think what is happening is that people don't feel, and this is where it's going to get a little bumpy. The cops,
I came for the bumpy ride. Go ahead and drive, sir.
The pilot's going to get, buckle up. It's getting ready to get a little bumpy. I think that when you don't have leadership, when I think that our current administration, and when we don't have, to me, just those that have the biggest platforms, let me say it that way, okay? And it is what it is. And as I said to somebody the other day, if my own father, who was a loving father, handled something wrong as an adult, we can address that. And that doesn't mean I don't respect my father or don't love my father. But if there are things that are not being done right, then God bless us if we can't open our mouths and say some things and call it what it needs to be. But when you don't have our top leadership speaking in ways that unify us as a nation, speaking in ways that bring peace and harmony, as opposed to nitpicking and fighting and creating fights and whatnot, I'm sorry. I don't know how we could have ever thought that we would see nothing but frustration amongst our youth in this generation. And if you look at the rioters, if you look at those that are protesting, they are just as white as they are black. Yeah. So this is not some, race card as much as it is. I just think people feel 100% like, who has my back? Who's in charge here?
Yeah, we have this misnomer where we always talk about power to the people, and in the euphoric world, the power is in the hands of the people, but in reality, power is in the hands of a small minority of people. Power is in the hands of a particular people group, a particular economic demographic, a particular political affiliation. And the challenge is that change happens when people of power yield their power in ways that will create change. So what part of the frustration that you're seeing is the people that have power are not necessarily using power so that everybody can have an equitable life. Now, I'm not just talking about the White House. I'm saying that the majority of the finances that are in the body of Christ in America are in churches where pastors today have not yet made a statement about the atrocities that are taking place in our world. When I say we, I'm talking about people of color. We don their stages, we sing their songs, we lead their worship, but we don't have an advocate right now from some of the most powerful voices in the body of Christ. That is a challenge. Also from the state of policy and politics leading up to our Senate and to our White House. It is not just okay to be against racism or to speak out against racism. There has to be an anti-racist platform that is pushed, an anti-racism agenda that is pushed. And unfortunately, what happens with people that are bigoted, they find refuge under the shadow of those people of influence that refuse to yield their influence. So they're in our congregations. Go ahead. I mean, they're in our congregations. They're on our softball teams, and they coach our children.
So all right. So my niece is white, right? My nephew is married to a beautiful white young lady. Mm-hmm. Karen is my niece, beautiful. We love her.
Yes.
Exactly. My nephew is half Jewish, right? So we have white people in our church. You have white people in your church. All right. So somebody else that's white got black kids, and you can go down the list. And somebody in their family is married to a black person and all that kind of stuff. And we sometimes think that, well, if that's the case, that ends racism.
Oh.
If that's the case, then there's no bigotry, right? Right. So if we have white people on our platform, so if I'm a white pastor and I got a black youth pastor, then we're not racist.
That's that's foolishness. It's foolishness, but it's a willful ignorance. It's a willful ignorance to the conversation, to the context. It's never having to go beyond the first layer of existence. Like, to be in the same room with one another does not necessarily mean that we're in relationship. Relationship requires that we pull back.
Say that again.
I said, just because we're in the same room does not mean that we're in relationship. Relationship is when you pull back the layers and you have dialogue about you as a person and me as a human being and the unique complexities of what makes me different than you, and how do we still come together and do something meaningful in this life, even though we have different thoughts and opinions and feelings and emotions. That's important. And it's an increasing challenge, because moments like this is when people of minority contexts take note of not just their own plight, but of the allies that they have within the plight. And the social media platform has allowed the message, whether good or bad, to get out faster than ever before. Yeah. You wake up one morning and all of a sudden
you're behind.
Video. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And people will jump on top of this stuff, and they know who's talking, who's not talking, who's making a statement, who's not making a statement, who's empowering, who's not empowering. This stuff, it gets out there. And I just don't think it always represents the heart of non-Black leaders. But at the same time, we can't just be hearers, we have to be doers.
Yeah.
And it's time to take the next step into doing, particularly in moments like this. Time to take the next step, besides saying, you know, hey, we're against racism, but stand in front of your congregation and tell these guys, gals, if you're in our congregation and you're racist, come to the altar and repent today, or find another place to worship.
Yeah.
You know, but we can no longer be business owners and employ racist CEOs and misogynistic CEOs. We can no longer allow them to, like I said, coach our children, be the basketball leader, no matter how gifted and talented they are. And there is no group of people that is more positioned to help move the positive cause of anti-racism forward than our brothers and sisters that are white.
Yeah.
Because the average racist only uses racism when there is minimal resistance to their racist behavior. So they wait until their handcuffs on, or they wait until people are asleep, or they wait until, you know, nobody can question them in the board meeting room to exact these behaviors. But if I am a white person and I'm having dinner and I hear Joe Watermelon say something racist, I'm positioned to challenge it.
Yeah.
If I'm in a conversation and I hear it maybe across my bed, I'm positioned to challenge it. And it doesn't mean that you create enemies, but it does mean that you heighten the dialogue, bring a level of awareness to it, so that people can start to see that we're not talking about something that happened in 1619. We're not talking about something that took place in the 60s and 70s. We're talking about things that are currently happening in real life in 2020, and they need to be addressed.
I think that's why you're seeing your current agitation, riots, this, that, and the other and I think this is why the subject has become front and center. I don't care if you weren't trying to pay attention to this issue, now you have to pay attention.
You have no choice, absolutely.
And in a way, it's different. We remember the Rodney King beating and the rioting in LA, if you're old enough. But this feels extremely different. And I think the reason why is because of all of the media platforms, mainly social media. Again, like you said, by the time you wake up in the morning, I'm talking about the average 20-year-old, 18-year-old, 17-year-old, and younger and older has already given you their take on what they're seeing by what their friend has shot live from a building that's burning right behind them, somebody that got spit in the face, so forth and so on. I think that one of the things that is a discussion that we don't have enough with this issue and this topic is the fact that if you look around in your green room, if you look around at your conference, if you look around in your so-called kumbaya meeting that you're having, and all y'all look exactly alike. If you're having an event and all your events, and if you're going golfing, if you're going on a fishing trip, and that's a business or your circle of people, and it's all the same, then to me, my friend, something is imbalanced when it comes to the race issue in your organization. That's the first thing. Secondly, if you are looking around in your group and in your section of people and whatnot, and there are people of different color, but the culture is still the same, likened unto just white or you, or if it's black and you got white people and it's still just a real black culture, you still probably have not solved the problem. And you probably still have not really, if anything, you probably just are stroking your own ego to say, hey, you're just as bad as somebody that goes and buys groceries and then goes out to where the homeless people are and then say, turn the camera on, look at me feeding the homeless people. The Bible says you're not supposed to talk about that stuff. But we see people on social media all the time, oh, look, we feed, homeless. And I'm not saying you can't share the good news of what you're doing mission-wise, but at the same time, the motive at the same time has to be brought into question, because I think in order for, and I'm going to turn it back over to you and you take it wherever you want to go. But I think in order for you to really address this issue, I think you have to deal with history. And I think that's the problem. Yeah. Again, I think just because I have a white niece in my family, or just because I have a black adopted baby or African baby in my family, that does not deal at all with the imbalance and the injustice for us to have our prisons packed with black men when we are less than a quarter of the society. Yeah. If you start going down all these numbers, it's like, come on, this is a much bigger issue. And I get it. If I'm used to my country club being all black and all of a sudden I start seeing white people come in, yeah, I can see where that's a problem.
Well, change is not easy, and change requires us to change. So
hey, Terrell, I thought white people got mad when Obama was president. I thought a lot of white pastors got mad. I heard pastors on TV talk against Obama in a way that they'd never spoken against other leaders before. Pastors, leaders, godfathers of the faith, the Christian faith. As a black Christian man, I was very put off by a lot of white pastors and white people on Christian television and the gatekeepers in the way they approach that president. And I think this is
This is all emblematic, but I would be remiss to say that this is not our president's fault. He is a symptom of something much bigger than himself.
Yes.
The fact that he's even where he is a symptom of something much bigger than himself. What you're talking about, those churches paid the price too. They called it the Black Flight. And what the Black Flight was a litany of hundreds of thousands of minorities that were lower and middle class Americans that went to predominantly white churches, that when a black president came, they realized that the temperature had changed in a negative way, and it had nothing to do with politics. It had everything to do with this idea that the presidency has been cheapened because a black man is now in office. And that's an affront to intelligence. That's an affront to us as Christians, and it's an affront to our African-American lineage and heritage. And as a result, there were people that left middle-class churches. In fact, we have some recipients at our church now that called and just said, Pastor, we just need to be connected to a conversation that's a little bit more balanced. And it took him being the ripple that was thrown in the pond to somewhat express that. Now, I'm like you, I'm very surprised at some of the voices that I heard that didn't just speak out against the politics, but was crude and vile in their language, very colorful in their language, reminiscent of the 60s, that was harsh and hard to hear. And some of my Spanish speaking brothers too, man, I just kind of felt like, wow, y'all are really on one right now. So, it was tough to see. It was tough to be a part of. But part of my question is to you is, in the effort to talk about the historicity of how we got to this place, if I'm talking to my brother or to my sister that is white, how do I approach this conversation and make the ground or the atmosphere conducive for truth telling? Because the Bible teaches the truth makes us free, and in one sense, because of falsities, there are good people that are not able to come from the prison of privilege, because it's not an easy conversation to have truth about. There's this sense that if I tell truth, I'm going to lose ground. If I acknowledge truth, then I'm acknowledging that I was a racist, but I didn't put anybody on the tree, and I didn't, exact racism. There's this sense that if we tell the truth about our history, that it will some kind of way make people
Take us
lose
back.
ground or make them feel guilty or something like that. How do you create a ground where truth can be told? Because we can't move forward without really acknowledging and dealing with truth.
I think it's such a great question. And the first thing I would say, especially on the Black side, and I've been accused of being, panhandling to white people, or, not being a part of the Black, movement and all that kind. So I know what it is to get it on both sides. The first thing I think is, if you're Black, is not to approach anybody as if they owe you anything. That's the first thing, because like you said, currently, if you're dealing with a white man currently today, he hadn't been around long enough to be a part of slavery. He hasn't been around long enough to even be a part of where the real root issue came from. He really doesn't. And that's the first thing anybody that is ignorant on the white side is probably going to say, which I'll address that in a second. But so the first thing is, if you are Black and you're going to approach this conversation to speak to white people about it, I think you can't be accusatorial. And I don't even know if that's a word or not.
But we got it. We got it. If you just would have rolled with it, we would have been like, Pastor Javen's so smart.
So I just don't think you can approach people with this mentality like as if they owe you something, or accusing them of something. It's not about that. It's about bringing about an understanding of where I'm coming from and what I've been dealing with. It would be the same as if you are a former NFL player. If I look at you and say, well, what the heck, man, just run those, 30 yards, 50 yards, and, y'all got to go and do, you got to get stretched before you do that, or you got to have a trainer. I never had a trainer. I just go to the gym, and you look at me like, son, you have no idea. Shut up. Right? If you'd say to me, hey, listen, man, just sing, can't you just start singing them notes, and, can't you, oh, y'all got to warm up, you got to warm your voice, me, what are you doing that for? That seems like you're just acting stupid. And I would look back at you and say, you have no idea. I think that sometimes as a people, we have no idea of each other's journey. That when you see me at the school, at the college, and you see you at the school, whereas you probably got all your stuff paid for in advance by your parents, I had to go through a government system, a federal pension, a Pell Grant, a student loan, a scholarship of some type, just to get through the first semester. Yeah. Whereas you had X, Y, and Z, and now where does that come from? Were my parents lazy? No, they worked just as hard as yours. But were the opportunities there for them as opposed to that? No, they weren't there. Now, why is that? That's because, and you go all the way back to Jim Crow laws, you go all the way back to the voters' right imbalance that we dealt with, and you go all the way back, and unfortunately, it is what it is, slavery. And what that was and why that went as long as it did. And we know that it was more of a money issue than it was anything. And to be honest with you, that's still kind of some of what we're dealing with now. There are people that are willing to turn a blind eye on a lot of things because their money is getting paid, including Blacks that get in certain positions. So it really starts becoming a conversation, I think, about educating ourselves. It's not about you, my white brother Bob, or me, your Black brother Javen. It's about what we are dealing with as a whole, as a human race. So that's how, in my opinion, you start the conversation. Mm-hmm. Because when we try to put it on just the Johnson family or the Campbell family or the Smith family, first off, that's too small, that's too minute. The Johnsons ain't prejudiced, and the Campbells ain't. You see what I'm saying? The Fletchers ain't, we ain't with the Fletch, and we not. And y'all might be white, we might be Black, And us just talking about it ain't gonna get nowhere.
Right.
Our family speaking. What we have to talk about is the history. And we cannot be afraid to talk about the history, because history is history. It's facts. It's facts. Rather you hurt by it, rather it was who, regardless, man, it's facts. It is what it is. But if you don't know where you came from, there's a shameless plug in my new book, Do It Now, that's coming out in July the 12th.
Where's my copy?
In my book, Do It Now, and I'm going to turn it back over to you because I feel like I've been talking too much. I talk about, there's a chapter called Understanding Your Beginnings. That it's hard to live in your now when you don't understand. And I say in the chapter, I purposely didn't call it fix your beginnings. I purposely didn't call it, change your beginnings, undo, write your beginnings. Can't do nothing with it. All you can do is understand it so that you can know how to move forward now.
Yeah. History are the stairs that lead you to the building that you're trying to get to.
I told you I could count on you for these one-liners. Come on. Where's that book? You need to do that book. A book of, I'm telling you, wisdom keys, man. History is
Can I finish my point, please? Can I finish my point? So, no, but history are the steps. And we get to where we're going off of the shoulders of somebody's great achievements or somebody's colossal failures. Yeah. All of them build something that we can step on. If we ignore it, if we ignore history, then we're moving, but we're not ascending. We have a lot of action, but we're not going anywhere. And unfortunately, it feels like, particularly in our country, particularly, these last 35, 40 years or so, it's been a lot of movement, but it has not been a lot of ascension, particularly in this area of race and light. We don't want to have the conversation. Couple of reasons why we don't want to have the conversation. Because we refuse to link racism and socioeconomic disparities together. We refuse to have that conversation. And as long as they're two separate conversations, there's always going to be a group that has the ability to exact whatever they're feeling or sensing. And there's going to be a group that has to accept what that group exacts. Go ahead. I see you. Go ahead. Jump in.
I'm just throw this at you. I want you to address this. So you're telling me welfare people, black people being on welfare are not lazy. Like that's the reason why they're on welfare.
That is a misnomer.
Because a lot of people think that.
A lot of people think that because you're poor, you're lazy. And that is the biggest lie. Most people that are poor have to work 2 jobs, not 1. You can't be lazy and work 2 jobs. Many people that are poor don't have home care. They don't have child care. So they got to work those 2 jobs and come and clean the house and take care of 1 or 2 babies. Welfare, that's a whole nother conversation about welfare. Now, don't get me started on welfare. Welfare was meant to be the spare tire of your life. It wasn't meant to be the way you drive around the city, right? If you needed it, it's supposed to be a bridge. It's not supposed to be a way of life. However, the challenge is that when welfare is so readily available to a particular group of people that perpetually and constantly need help, then it's going to be the crutch that we lean to. And if you make that crutch a very appealing crutch, then it's hard to walk away from it. What do you mean, Pastor T, when you say appealing? By appealing, that means that if you give me $100 because I make less than $30,000 a year, I'll take it. But if you give me $300 if I have 3 children and make under, then I'll take that. And if you give me $500 if I have 3 children, no job, and don't have a spouse and a second spouse in the house, if you keep incentivizing my brokenness, it gets easier for me to take advantage of it because everybody needs a decent place to stay. Everybody needs a decent food to eat, and everybody needs money in order to do it. So in some senses, man, if we're not careful, welfare incentivizes brokenness. And because I understand the history, I'm not all the way convinced that was not an intentional or being weaponized, being used as a weapon to create class system, to create a class system. Racism and economics go hand in hand. Racism and economics go hand in hand. And it's only real ignorant people that think that are privileged because of their skin color.
Right.
There's only a certain demographic that, and unfortunately, I think that's what our president misses, is that when you empower the idea that your color makes you a superior person again, when you perpetuate that idea, and sometimes anonymous and whiteness, American and whiteness are synonymous with one another in certain conversations. When that idea is perpetuated, man, that is a dangerous combination to allow people that do not want to educate themselves or do the work or do the or go through the journey to compete in this world. It gives them this sense of superiority. So
Yeah.
now I can be an underachiever in performance, but as long as I'm white,
Yeah.
I'm better than you.
Yeah.
You know, I can be a deadbeat in many regards in my life, but as long as I'm white, I'm better than you. So they're coming out of the mountains and out of the hills, and they're coming out of, you know, all kind of places, feeling like, hey, they're better than an accomplished person of color.
Yeah.
And by better, I don't necessarily mean, well, I guess in their instance, they do feel like there's
No, it is. It's better. It's
an
better.
endowment. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you read history, now you got to stay with me. If you read history, you will see that the idea and the concept of Anglo-Saxon superiority is not a new idea. But we don't like to go through the concept of I'm reading a great book now called Titan. It's the story of Rockefeller and as he ascended to become the richest person in the world through the standard oil industry. And if you know anything about the Rockefellers, they are directly connected. His in-laws were the Spelmans, the ones that endowed Spelman College down in Atlanta, Georgia, one of the most famous historically Black colleges. This was kind of his pet project, which was to give education to Southern Black people. This was kind of something that he wanted to do. And in the book, it's recounting the thought process of some of the biggest names. We still drive their vehicles. We still get their energy. Some of the greatest names was opposed to it because there was an undercurrent of belief that Black minds did not have the intellectual capacity as Anglo-Saxon minds, so it was a waste of energy to try to train them in anything other than vocational skills. So it was to train their body, but never to train their mind. This kind of stuff is not new.
All right, listen, we're gonna have to have like a part 3, 4, and 5.
Oh, let's do it. Let's do it.
Discussion, man. Because I mean, now you're the more you're talking, that's the more I'm kind of squirming in my seat, going, "Oh my God, we need about 4 more hours to talk about." Because I really, and I know some people thinking, "Oh, y'all are going too far." We're not going too far. We're not going far enough. Because I think this is where it starts. Again, you can't understand where we are until you know where we came from. That the whole intention of why Blacks were brought here in the first place was not for because some people say, well, I see Asian people come over here and they seem to do better than y'all, or I see other people come and they come and do better. How come that is and whatnot? You don't even understand that the way, because however you were invited to the party will determine how you.
It determines the role you play. It determines the role you're expected to play. However you were invited to the party determines the role we expect you to play.
Come on. And so you have a scenario and a system that was created with never for the intention for Blacks to be anything but slaves or but what you would consider servants and so forth and so on. And it's unfortunate that I think that fast forward many years later, there's still an undercurrent, an undertow, a systematic thing that is perpetuating this concept or this ideology that, and I want to say to somebody that's watching today, because somebody started, I don't know how the conversation came up, but I can tell you now, let me do a confessional here. I went to college in Tennessee, in the mountains of Tennessee. I grew up in South Florida, which is a multicultural area. It's kind of like the New York of the South. So I never dealt with real, quote unquote, racism kind of stuff. My family has always been a working class family, kind of give or take. Not we didn't have everything, but it was all right.
We grew up the same. I get it.
Yeah. But you got to say it for people.
Right. I get it. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
So,
Y'all
so,
pay attention to Pastor.
so, so I drove T for about 5 years between Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee, back and forth to college. So you can imagine 18-year-old to 22, whatever, getting pulled over from time to time, tail light, whatever. In the mountains of Tennessee, in the rural areas of Georgia, all this kind of stuff. Anytime I've ever been pulled over, all the years that I've been driving, I've traveled over, I've never been pulled over while driving black. I don't have that experience to tell. Any white cop that's ever dealt with me, that I've dealt with, I've never gotten nothing but the usual, the whatever you call it. I've never been pulled out of the car, yanked around, gun pointed on me, or any of that kind of stuff, right? But I'm smart enough to know that just because that didn't happen to me, that doesn't mean that does not happen. And I think that is the thing that is that people are trying to, how shall we say, try to kind of visualize that in their head. That just because they have not had these experiences. Now I'm black and I haven't had. You can only imagine a white person and talking about this. This seems fictitious. This seems like the race card. It seems dramatic. It seems a jumping to the gun. Address that a little bit, as we are kind of wrapping this up. What can we do to kind of help people understand that the whole mentality of and the system of this, it happens, and it happens a lot in a lot of different ways in a lot of different scenarios.
I think the shame of it is, and if there are two groups of people that I would like to address, I have been pulled over for driving while black. I have been face down and didn't know why. I have had a few instances growing up in Missouri where, we knew that our situation was not because we were doing anything wrong. I have, in my older years, my adult years, been a part of the privileged community in this regard, that I was a celebrated athlete, professional football player. And even if I was pulled over, once they kind of see who you are, it got a little bit easier. And so I can admit that in many of my latter years, if the racism has not been as blatant, if I could say that, maybe in other ways that I could challenge, but maybe not so blatant, because I was a performer. I gave people a reason to be happy and to be smiling. So I want to talk to those African Americans that are performers. And I'm not just talking about entertainers. I'm talking about if you're gifted at anything.
I got you.
If you are better than the average person at anything and you're being celebrated for it, I want to challenge you. I also want to challenge my white brothers and sisters who have influence. And I'm not just talking about pastors. I'm hard on pastors because I am a pastor. Right. And I know that it is a platform for truth telling. But I'm not just talking about pastors. I'm speaking of CEOs and business owners and the head of the PTA and the lead teacher at work. I'm talking to you because we are a unique group that have influence in both communities, and we cannot expect there to be change and expect there to be a positive forward movement from moments in our history like these. This is not an incident. This is a moment in our history, a moment in our history like this, and we not be engaged in the conversation. So we don't get to sit on our couches and say, boy, that's terrible what's happening to them in Minnesota, or that's horrible what's happening in Chicago, or it's horrible what happened to that young man in Florida. We don't get a chance to sit back and say, boy, that's horrible. I wonder how Pastor Terrell and his church feel about this. We have to be intentional about being engaged in the dialogue and in the conversation, because what if positioning is a part of purpose? What if God, in his infinite mind, positioned you in this privileged position so that you can walk in a purpose greater than just having more people at your church or getting another promotion because you're gifted? What if the position was so that other people could walk in the promise? I had this thought about Moses because Moses had a dialogue with God at the burning bush. And God said, take your shoes off for this holy ground you're standing on. And Moses essentially said back to God, well, what do you want with me? And God said that I'm going to use you to go and talk to Pharaoh so that my people might be set free. That's what he told him.
Right.
And he says, but God, I'm slow to speak. And I'm not real good at orating. That's not my skill. And God says, I'll have Aaron for you. He said, but I don't really have any weapons. Like, how am I going to go? And God tells him to stick your hand in your cloak and take your hand out. And the miracle that takes place with that. And of course, the staff that's in his hand, which is all that he had as he stood before God. God said, put it on the ground. It turns to a serpent. He said, now pick it up. And it turns back into a staff. And what he tried to show Moses was he was trying to help Moses understand that you might not think you can orate, but you have no excuse. You might not think that you have power, he says, but you do have a divine power. And he says, you might not think you have anything to fight with, which is the staff. He says, you do have something in your hand. You just have to use it. And I say that to each of us, that everybody has a sphere of influence that they operate in. And wherever your sphere of influence is, it doesn't have to be a big, huge stage. It doesn't have to be on the major news stations. Wherever your sphere of influence is, confront injustice, challenge injustice. I promise you, they're going to still invite you in because you are part of the gifted privilege. They need what you have, but don't let redlining happen. And don't let excluding someone because he's a female happen. And don't let some of these isms take place because God has perhaps, like he did Moses, he positioned him for purpose. Moses, the reason why you understand Pharaoh's house and why you spent so much time there is so that you could cry out and call out the injustice that's coming from the house. You see what I'm saying? So that is my challenge, man. And that is, and I take that wholeheartedly, and I challenge people of influence, and I challenge, and I continue to tell the general public, your grandmothers and your grandfathers, your mothers and your fathers, and even now you have invested in that community. Some of them are homes that you own. Some of them are homes that you lease. But nonetheless, whether you're a homeowner or renter, if you've been there for a generation, 2 generations, your family has an ownership stake in that neighborhood, in that community. Don't burn it to the ground. Do not burn it to the ground, because nobody's going to be rushing back to build up the buildings that you create and make abandoned. And when they do, I promise you, the money that you're going to borrow to try to build it back up is going to cost you a lifetime's worth of wealth before you become an owner of it again. So I get the frustration and the anger. I get the disappointment. I do get it, but it does have to be redirected in a way that is not so destructive to the history and the work and the sweat equity that has gone into making your community what it is today. So be mindful of that. And I'm done.
Ooh, well, we have to leave it right there. I think that's pretty much the way to close a discussion like this out. You couldn't have said it better. The idea that God would allow Moses in the house of Pharaoh to deal with the issues of that day in Egypt, to bring about that victory and bring about that great emancipation, I think speaks volumes to those of us in privilege, or those of us that are inside the green rooms, and those are 1 or 2 of us that have these positions, that the idea. And that goes for black or white, doesn't matter who you are, because there are white people that are in the struggle and just as frustrated as there are blacks, might be for different reasons, but they are still feeling marginalized or feel left out. And so I just think it's important, I think, for all of us, both. I think the one thing I do want to say before we end this is the idea that in the first time in the history of the world, in the human race, that we all have a platform. That this is the first time in the history of the world that we don't have to wait on Walter Cronkite, on the 1 or 2 networks that give us our information and tell us what to do. We no longer have to do that, but we all have a platform that we can express and share. And unfortunately, like all things, we can either use it for ignorance, we can use it for misinformation, or we can use it to get right information and right understanding. But at the end of the day, I would want to encourage all of us, both laymen and leaders, to stay in front of the issues.
Mm.
This is what I would really want before the young man. The issue for me, for the young man that got killed in Georgia, I can't think of his name, Aubrey. What was his
Mm-hmm.
name?
Yes.
The issue for me, for him, was the fact that somebody thought that it was okay for them to take the law into their own hands, and that this young man's life was worth, if like kill him, and then on top of that, to have 2 months, 2 to 3 months go by and nothing be done until there's a camera shown. And then now Georgia wants to realize they have a problem. Same thing for Minnesota. And you can go back through all the other times that this starts happening. You know, the reason why these kids go to this irate position and they go to acting out, I guess I'd liken it unto a child that's in their teens, and they start acting out because the parent just has completely ignored them. So you start seeing drugs and that kind of stuff. I want to say to us as people, as churches, as leaders, don't ignore the cries. Don't ignore the issues. Don't be so caught up in so much, like you said, in building your own kingdom, that you're disconnected to what the real hurts are of people and what the real issues are of people, so that we can, because you can't lead from behind. Thanks, my brother, for having this transparent conversation with me.
I do appreciate it, man. You're a thought leader, and you're a person that we count on in public, and I get to count on you in private, fortunately. And I appreciate you, man. This is important. And when I got the text message, hey, man, let's go on Zoom and let's talk. I know we share so many of the similar views. It was an absolute yes. So, man, God bless you. And you guys keep fighting a good fight down there. Keep building bridges and not burning them. And keep reminding people, man, that there is hope out in front of us. But it is going to take courage for every party involved in order for us to get there.
Likewise. Love you, my brother.
Love you, man. Peace out.